even though technically that's after the revolution, the war itself. Remember, that we're not just limited to the revolution in terms of which you deal with. The Constitution might be a perfect thing to look at in terms of thinking about this contradiction, because now these colonies are their own nation. Right now they're making their own rules. They can no longer use the excuse that Britain is making them enslave people, which is part of what some folks did. A lot of colonists did try to blame Britain specifically. So at the end of the video, they talk about, okay, the war is now won, but what's going to happen in terms of this new nation? What is the new nation going to look like? And how much of that is going to revolve around slavery, which is so central to its economy. So kind of what's interesting about this is that they have to now rule themselves, right? They're now a nation. But with that comes certain responsibilities and certain problems that they have to figure out. Remember that this anti-slavery movement is really kind of picked up with the revolution. A lot of folks will recognize that the contradiction is there, that they just fought a war for freedom, yet they're trying to enslave other people. So we talked about them coming to the Constitutional Convention the first time, and they sit down and try to make some of these rules. They literally have to kind of carve it out. They literally have to decide what the nation is going to look like. So 12 out of the 13 states would attend the Constitutional Convention. 12 of the 13 of them will send representatives to sort of craft what the nation is going to look like. This happens in Philadelphia in 1787. Right, 1787. Rhode Island, the state of Rhode Island, does not send anyone. Rhode Island has always been this kind of rebellious colony from its beginnings, and they're kind of not interested in it. Remember, this is a difficult project in forming this new nation. Some folks think when the war is over, there's going to be 13 different nations here, not one United States. So this may be a sign here in terms of Rhode Island's rebelliousness. They do not send anyone. After some initial debate between the various delegates, it's going to become clear that instead of just amending the Articles of Confederation, which was the sort of temporary government, the kind of temporary constitution that had gotten them through the war, instead of just making some minor revisions to that, they're going to have to throw it out, and they're going to have to start over. And ultimately, the Constitution is what comes out of that process. They're not just able to make some minor revisions because there are some major problems with the Articles of Confederation. They're going to form a whole new document. Of the 55 delegates that show up, that come to represent their various states, they're all white males. Right? So in terms of diversity, racial diversity, there is none. Most of them are wealthy farmers. Right? So if you think about class here, and maybe perhaps making your argument about the conservative nature or why a lot of these folks may have been so invested in the revolution, you might think about that. They're either wealthy farmers or lawyers or really upper class elite figures, merchants. Some of you made a reference to that in your thesis statements, in fact, about how merchants in New England and then wealthy slave owners in the South finally have something in common during this revolution. Many are college graduates, and most had some prior political experience. So the reason they're selected or sent by others had to do with their status in the community. Yet this is not a diverse group, either in terms of race or class or gender. There's no women there either. So in many respects, this is a very elitist group. So the delegates do not try to create a pure democracy. We think, as Americans now, we think about this idea of democracy as this great thing. Right? The founding fathers would not have used that word democracy. Democracy in their time period really had more of the connotations of being out of control, kind of the rule of the mob, the rule of common people. And they were not common people. These were elite folks that kind of in some ways looked down upon common people. Not just African Americans, but common whites as well. They, in some respects, are going to want to craft a government that keeps as much power as possible out of the hands of the people, out of the direct hands of the people, I should say. They saw themselves as kind of the true representatives of this society. Right? They thought it would be dangerous, in fact, to put too much power in the hands of the people or the rule of the mob. So you often heard the term mobocracy instead of democracy at this time, because people thought the crowd gets out of control. These common people don't necessarily know how to rule. Right? They associated this term democracy with mob rule, almost with anarchy, if you think of it that way. Instead, they wanted to create a political system that gives some indirect control to the people, but keeps a lot of that power out of the direct control of the people. Only the House of Representatives would be directly elected by the people. And only the House of Representatives would be directly elected by the people. Senators were to be appointed. They were to be essentially selected by state legislatures. So you see how that's not directly in the hands of the people. You're not directly electing them. It's a way of sort of keeping that power separate. And the president, of course, would be selected by the Electoral College, a process that still very few people understand. Right? These electors are actually the ones that do the electing. It is not a pure democracy in that sense. Political scientists will probably tell you much more about that process than I can. But think about how that's really kind of removing direct power, because they were in some ways afraid of the people. This was called the so-called Madisonian model. Madisonian model after James Madison. The Madisonian model. Keeping as much of the direct control from the people as possible. Really kind of ruled by the elites. These 55 delegates are an interesting group, right? They are divided themselves on a number of issues, even though we said they're very similar in some ways, right? They're all wealthy, they're all male, they're all white. They themselves are going to have some important divisions. So there's some ideas that this Constitution might not get done. They're so divided on certain things that there are some points of contention. For example, some of them are the representatives of larger states, whereas some of them are going to be the representatives of smaller states. So that's one of the reasons Rhode Island doesn't bother to send anybody. Rhode Island is so small, they're like, we're not going to have any say. Right? If it's based on population, Virginia, the most populous state, is always going to outvote us. So Rhode Island's kind of like, you know what, we're not really into that at all. So large states come and they say, you know what, we're large states. So since we have so many people, since we have larger populations, we should have a larger say in what happens. Because they have this population. Whereas smaller states, you're like, wait a second, we're all equal, right? As states, we're all equal. So shouldn't we have the same amount? So large states favored what they called proportional representation. Proportional representation. So basically, your number of representatives will be based on your proportion, on the number of people you have. So the more people you have, the more representatives. That's what they favored, right? In terms of representation in Congress. Right, so basing the number of representatives on each state's population was called the Virginia Plan. Again, Virginia has the most people. Obviously, they want to have the most political representation. Smaller states, though, again, are going to say, wait a second, we're all states. There's no state greater than another. We're all equal. So smaller states are going to favor equal representation. New Jersey is a smaller state in terms of population at this point. So this is often referred to as the New Jersey Plan. So you got the Virginia Plan on one hand that favors larger states, New Jersey Plan on the other hand that favors smaller states. And they're trying to figure out how they do this. Right? How is this going to work? As we know with politics, often it's about compromise. Each side has to give up something in order to get these things done. And this is what they do. There's going to be a number of important compromises that come out of these meetings on the Constitutional Convention. Many of them are going to have to do with slavery and the slave trade. Many of them are going to have to do with slavery and the slave trade. Yes?
Can you make that a little bit bigger, please?
I think so.
Thank you.
So think about Virginia Plan favors big states on their population. New Jersey Plan favors small states. And ultimately, to get it passed, they have to compromise. And this is going to be called the Connecticut Compromise. So they're going to sort of balance it out that both sides can kind of win in a sense. Right? Under the Connecticut Compromise, the delegates agreed that the House of Representatives would have proportional representation. So as we know in our system, bigger states have more representatives. Right? But the other side, in terms of the smaller states, say, well, okay, if we give you that in terms of the House of Representatives, what are we going to get in terms of the small states? So in the Senate, each state has 2 senators, regardless of size. Right, so that's why there's 100 senators, right, for the 50 states, whereas the number of representatives was 453 or some odd number based on population. In bigger states like California, New York, Texas, have many more representatives in smaller states like Rhode Island. So you kind of see how they're trying to balance things out. They're trying to get it done, and they have to compromise in order to do that. And a lot of this is going to have to do, again, with African Americans directly or indirectly because of the slave population. So, again, these important compromises regarding slavery. One of them is going to be the Three-Fifths Compromise that I'll mention here in a second. The delegates agreed that the importation of slaves could be prohibited only in 20 years. They agreed not to vote on the issue of the slave trade for 20 years. So they're sitting down in 1787, they said, we won't touch it until 1808. That's the first possible time we can deal with the slave trade, is 1808. Now what's interesting is January 1st, 1808, they do outlaw the slave trade at the first possible moment based on this sort of agreement they made. But just the fact that they say, you know what, we're not even going to talk about it at this point, shows you something. It shows you, one, how divisive an issue it was. They're like, look, we're never going to get this Constitution resolved if we don't sort of just put that to the side and sort of deal with the other business. It also shows you how important economically slavery is to this new nation. A lot of folks are like, look, even if we want to get rid of slavery, we can't do it now. We're not a colony anymore. We're a new nation. Our economy is based on slavery. We're going to go into debt. They really are nervous about and insecure, I guess you could say, about the nation's future, because they know they're relying on these slaves. So again, it shows you how central African Americans were, directly or indirectly, to this process. So they say won't touch the slave trade for 20 years. Again, ultimately, they do outlaw it in 20 years. They do not get rid of the entire institution of slavery, as we mentioned, but they are going to make it illegal to bring in more Africans from outside the U.S. in January 1st, 1808. Of course, there are going to be some smugglers, and people still do sneak and continue to bring folks in, but the numbers obviously drop tremendously on January 1st, 1808. Slavery itself, though, does remain legal. The institution does remain legal. They also agreed to count each slave as 3/5 of a person for determining representation in the House. So remember that earlier debate about population, right? Virginia's like, wait a second, we have the most people. But then you have, say, a northern state that didn't have very many African Americans. That's like, wait a second. Yeah, you got a lot of people, but are you counting those 40% of African Americans as people? No, they aren't people, right? Aren't they slaves? Technically property and not people? So Virginia is trying to have it both ways. Right? They say, oh, no, they're not people. That's our property. We defend our property rights, this and that. But then when it's time to vote, they're saying, oh, we got 2 million people, right? Yes, 600,000 of those may have been slaves. So some are saying, wait a second, you're being hypocrites, right? Are they people or are they property? This is a major debate. Are they going to be people or are they property? And there are implications of that debate. Right? At some point, you either have to pay taxes on this property, or this property may count for reasons of voting and representation. How do they solve it? They basically solve it by pulling out a calculator. Right? And this is the Three-Fifths Compromise. I think this Three-Fifths Compromise is particularly significant. Think about what that means, right? You're essentially saying a person is not a full person, right? You've made them into a fraction. Now, they could have said 1/2, might have made the math a little easier. But they basically said 3/5. They basically say that for every 5 slaves, there were 3 people in terms of representation. This is the formula they came up with. But think about this in terms of significance, right? The overall significance of this. It's dehumanizing. Right? You're saying that people are not people, this Three-Fifths Compromise. This is going to be written into the Constitution. So again, think about this in terms of our founding documents and how the founding documents themselves will dehumanize people of African descent from the very beginning. This is why later, say, a Malcolm X is going to say, you got to throw the Constitution out. How do you expect to have equality in a society when its founding documents were based on inequality? Whereas, say, Martin Luther King is going to say, yes, that's wrong, but we can open up the system and make it work equally for everybody. There's going to be a different philosophy when you get to, say, the civil rights movement over whether these documents can be used to fight racism if they were inscribed with racism from the very beginning. So that Three-Fifths Compromise is a very interesting and significant moment. Does that make sense in terms of the three-fifths compromise? So the three-fifths of a person for determining representation in the House of Representatives. Once the Constitution is drafted, right, once they sort of work out these difficult compromises and get it to the point where they can, draft it and vote on it, basically, it has to be ratified by each state. Right? So they got to take it around to each of the 13 states, and people have to agree on it. Right? Despite the fact that the delegates had compromised on a number of issues, there are still some holdouts that say, you know what, we're not sure about this. We're not sure about this thing. We're not sure if it's in our interest. There are still people who vigorously would oppose the new Constitution. People in favor of the Constitution begin to sort of form into a group, kind of the first political party, essentially. They call themselves the Federalists. The Federalists are in favor of the Constitution as it is drafted, as it is written. Those that oppose the Constitution will form themselves into a group opposed to the Federalists. So what do they call themselves? The Anti-Federalists. Pretty creative thing, right? They say, you guys are the Federalists, we're anti-you, we're the Anti-Federalists. Later they would change their name to the Democratic Republicans. This is going to be the party of Thomas Jefferson. So you have the Federalists and you have the Anti-Federalists that really form as kind of two political parties around the founding document, the Constitution. Federalists, Anti-Federalists.
The Federalist is Republican?
No. The naming gets a little confusing. First you have Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Later the Anti-Federalists will change their name to the Democratic-Republicans. Democratic Republicans. Republican Party doesn't form until way later, to around the Civil War. So the names get a little confusing. Don't let that throw you. During the fall and winter of 1787 and 1788, both sides are kind of arguing for their position, right, either for or against the Constitution. The Federalists themselves kind of go on the offensive to try to get people to vote for it. They would write a series of documents called the Federalist Papers that argue in favor of the Constitution. Right? But again, the Anti-Federalists are nervous about this document for several reasons. Many prominent Federalists include James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, who's going to be Secretary of the Treasury under George Washington, and John Jay, who's going to be a Supreme Court Justice early on. They're prominent Federalists. They write these Federalist Papers defending the Constitution as it is written. Right? This is known as the Federalist Papers. You can still buy copies of this and read some of the arguments in favor of it. In states like New York, where it appeared that the vote would be close, Federalist and Anti-Federalist arguments go back and forth in the newspapers. So there are some areas where this is really closely contested. By July of 1788, 11 of the 13 states had ratified the Constitution. 11 of the 13 had ratified it, but that means that two states are like, we don't think so. Those two states are going to be Rhode Island and North Carolina. Rhode Island and North Carolina are like, we're not sure about this. All right, a number of Anti-Federalists remain concerned, particularly about whether this new federal government is going to protect individual rights and states' rights. So from the very beginning, you have this kind of fear of federal power and state power, right? Federal government, state government, who's going to be in charge? Now, of course, this is not going to go away. If we think about 80 years later, right, you're going to have a civil war, largely over slavery and largely over federal government versus state government, who's really in charge. So these issues never truly get resolved if we think about it. But it starts here. Delegates like Thomas Jefferson want the Constitution to be expanded and say specific things, to specifically protect certain individual rights, specifically to protect certain states' rights. So before they sign it, these Anti-Federalists say, look, we need to make some modifications, we need to make some additions or amendments to the Constitution. Even before they agree to sign it, they believe that there are some things that are needed. For example, the government should not make laws limiting religion, free speech, freedom of the press, right? Things that we're very familiar with, freedom of assembly, right? And basically it should guarantee individual liberties, right? Individual liberties. Again, the two states that had not yet ratified the Constitution are Rhode Island and North Carolina. And they want such guarantees before they're going to sign it. They're like, you know what, you could take that somewhere until you add something to it, we're not signing it. Federalists initially are like, you know what, you guys are overreacting. Like, this document is, you know, what it doesn't prohibit is going to be legal. The anti-federalists are like, no, we can't have that, right? In absence and sort of assuming that it's going to guarantee certain things, you have to write it in the document. Right? So the anti-federalists, Jefferson and others in particular, are going to argue for this strenuously. Federalists don't feel like it's necessary. But to ensure that all states would ratify it, the Federalists would agree to propose a Bill of Rights. Remember, the Bill of Rights is the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So like the First Amendment, freedom of speech, press, religion, the Fifth Amendment, due process, the Eighth Amendment, extreme punishment, basically. So think about these first 10 amendments to the Constitution. That's our Bill of Rights. Many of them focus on individual rights and sort of states' rights because they could not get the document ratified without adding that. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Once these Bill of Rights are proposed by Congress in 1789, North Carolina and Rhode Island would join the other states in ratifying the Constitution. All right, once the Constitution then is ratified, the new government can get started. All right, they're like, okay, now we have a document. We have a founding document. And they unanimously agree that George Washington will be the first president. All right, so Washington is going to be inaugurated in 1789. He is, the unanimous choice. Everybody basically agrees that he's going to be the man to run this stuff. And so, this is why he's always referred to as the kind of father of the